Hello everyone, this is Himdad Abdulqahar Muhammad again with you in another video within the translation module entitled Translation Theory and Practice, and this will be lesson number 4, in which we will be talking about translation process. In other words, the processes or the steps that translators must follow and take in order to accomplish a translation task. As the beginning, an introduction to that topic, we have to remember that when we get a text to be translated, that text is called source language, SL, and the required task would deliver something called target language text. Throughout the history of translation, there has been several attempts in order to identify what are the processes and steps that translators must take and follow in order to accomplish that translation task in the best way possible. But there is no one unique set of processes or steps. So each writer, each author, and even each translator has his own preferences concerning the processes and the steps that they follow. In this lesson, we try to acquaint you with a number of these views and different ideas, and you as the reader and the viewer of this video will have the final call and the final decision to make. The first important model presented by Eugene Nida about the translation process. Nida says that source language text needs to be analyzed first, and then for the process of transferring this into the target language, it needs to be restructured, and then translation will be yielded at the end. So it is 5 processes or 5 steps: a text in the source language, analysis of that text, and the transfer of the result of the analysis, the restructuring of this into the receptor language, or what is called the target language, and then the final result will be the translation of the target into the target language. On the other hand, Newmark has a different view concerning the translation process. To Newmark, translation is a craft that consists also of 4 steps. The first important thing is the comprehension and understanding of the content of the text to be translated. So the comprehension is the first step, and then this comprehension or this understanding needs to be interpreted in the mind of the translator, and then it needs to be formulated in the target language, and then it needs finally to be recreated, or recreation is the final step in order to yield the desired target language translated text. As we know that when we do any translation task, we have to keep in mind that language consists of several components. For example, sounds that are specific to that language, the words and the vocabulary of that language, and we are dealing with grammar, and then we are dealing with style. And we have to ask ourselves, what do we translate? Do we translate sounds? Do we translate vocabularies? Do we translate grammar, or do we translate style? What we are interested in is how these elements all combine, all produce, influence, reflect, and crystallize meaning all together. And another important question is, how do we translate? In order to translate something, we have 2 concepts to use. The first thing is called processes of translation. The second would be methods of translation. For this lesson, we would be more focusing on the processes of translation. Since translation is a communicative process, it has to deal with the following processes. First, the process of analysis or comprehension, the process of transfer or transmission, and the process of restructuring or rearrangement and rewriting of the text. Then the issue of process and product would come into existence. Usually they say translation is a process, or as a process, and translation as a product. We have to distinguish between these two. When we say translating, so the process which refers to the activity rather than the tangible object. When we say translation, the product of the process of translating, that's to say the translated text. The word translation can sometimes also refer to the abstract concept which encompasses both the process of translating and the product of that process. So for a translator, it is important to distinguish between the process of translating and the product of the process of translating. That would be translation. So translating and translation. Translating is the process, and translation is the result of that process. Another version of the translation process was explained by Bell in 1991, and Bell says that everything happens in the memory of the translator. If you have, for example, a source language text, as you can see in the left hand of the window of the screen, this source language text needs to be analyzed, and then it needs to have a semantic representation in the memory of the translator, and then that semantic representation is synthesized or recreated in the mind in order to yield the target language text. So translation process is the source language text transformed into a target language text by means of a process which takes place within the memory. And the analysis of that language specific text, that's to say this SLT, into a universal or non-language specific semantic representation. And the last step is the synthesis or the creation of that semantic representation into a second language specific text, that's to say the target language text. So translation process versus product comprises of 9 steps in general. The first thing, the translator receives signal 1 containing the message. Then the translator recognizes code 1 according to the language in which that signal or that text is written. And then the translator tries to decode the signal 1 and retrieves the message in his memory, in his mind, and he comprehends the message. And then he tries to select code number 2, the target language code that he wants to convey the message into that language. And he tries to encode the message that he retrieved and he comprehended by means of code 2. And then he selects the channel or the medium of translation in order to transfer that. And finally, transmits signal 2, which contains the message but in another language, that's to say in target language. The process of translation, as we said, is viewed differently by different writers. This is another version of the process of translation that starts with first specification, to say the text type or the target audience, the purpose of the translation, and the reference material, tools, and even terminologies. And then the second step is terminology research and reading. So a translator or a good translator must try to create a glossary that is based on the client needs of that text that are related to this field of the text, and then he starts the translation or the production of a text in the target language which communicates the meaning of the text in the source language and taken into account the specifications designed or offered or requested by the client itself. Then after that draft of target language comes the role of editing, which compares the source text to the target text checking completeness, accuracy, style, register, consistency, and even readability. After editing is done, then we come to proofreading. In proofreading step, we have to check the target text for typographies if there are any mistakes, spellings, grammar, punctuation, and consistent usage of terminology. Consistency is very important here. Then after proofreading comes the role of formatting. In formatting step or phase, we have to check for consistency of forms and emphasis, of numbering, for example, bullets and numbering, spaces, margins, graphics, tables, and even colors. Then after the formatting is done, it is the role of verification, or the turn of verification that comes into play, into the scene now. So quality assurance is very important, and the comparison of the final version of the translation with the original and the comparison with the specifications of the client are also important. And only after verification comes the role of delivery or submission of the final version. That's to send a requested translation to the client in whatever format you have agreed upon. If we try to shorten and summarize the steps and the stages involved in any translation work, we can divide it into 4 main stages and steps. The first one is called preparation. In preparation comes the role of specifications, or the characteristics of the original that are considered for the translation, or in short, it's called the client's requirement. What does the client require from you? The second part of the preparation comes the terminology, research, and reading. Based on the original text or original document, it is very useful for future translations as well to collect your own glossary of that field and terminologies that are used in this field. After this stage is done, then it comes the work stage. Translation into the target language is required as the first step, and then comes the role of editing to compare the original text and its translated version. Proofreading, it is a revision of the translated text, punctuation and format and others. Formatting also comes checking if the translation resembles the format of that original text. The third stage is called final revision, or we called it verification. One last check of the final version of the translation is to compare it with the original and the client's requirements or instructions at the preparation stage. Then comes the final stage of delivery or submission to the client. The client receives translation as per agreed terms and conditions. Some writers come up with other stages and they called it important stages in translation. For example, it is very important prior to any translation task, you have to know who are the target readers of your translation and what would be the communicative effect that is desired from the translated text, and the variety of language that is required, whether it is a specific type of the target language or a standardized type. And another stage would be a very specific vocabulary and language that the translator should respect to keep consistency, even those words, phrases, or structures that should be avoided to be taken into consideration. Number 5, previously translated material or any other reference material will be very helpful in this respect and makes your life easier or makes your task easier. And the format in which the translation should be delivered should be agreed upon right from the beginning. Computer-assisted translation tools, if there are, they need to be taken into consideration. So these are points that translators must keep in mind prior to any translation task to be started. Finally, if we can come up with a conclusion of what steps should translators take in order to accomplish a translation task, we can say there are 5. The best practice language translation process involves these 5 steps. First, scope out the text to be translated. Second, the initial translation. Third, review the accuracy of the translation. 4, take a break. And 5, refine the translation wording. Now, in the coming slides, we try to shed light on each of these steps in more detail. If we come to the first one, the first step is to scope out the text to be translated. This step is to get a feel for the text you are going to translate. That's to say, the subject matter and the content, how long it is, the writing style, if it is technical, and the various sections, and etc. The translator will typically read or skim read parts of the text to get an overview of the content. A quick reading or some parts of it, it's called skim read. They may note key concepts or terminologies that they will need to do research, and will decide if any preliminary background reading is needed or is required to get the feel and to get into that field. And sometimes in this stage they will research and resolve how they will translate key terms before beginning the translation. This step is very important because there are some key terms in any text, so you have to keep in mind what terminologies do you use or what terminologies are actually used in this field of the text. After this step is done, then we go to step 2, which is called the initial translation step. Now, they systematically translate the document, typically in chunks of 5 to 10 words at a time. This is usually what translators do, chunks of 5 to 10 words at a time. And choosing the appropriate length of the individual text chunks to deal with is very important. Ideally, each chunk will be a discrete and complete unit of meaning. So you don't need to go until the end of the sentence or until the end of the paragraph to translate. Maybe 5 to 10 words together. If you think that it completes a meaning, then you can translate that. Each chunk has also to be short enough to retain in the short-term memory of the translator, because he can connect them together, and anything over about 10 words can be a struggle or a challenge or difficult to translate all together. Sentences are usually and frequently longer than this, so will typically need to be split up into shorter units. Working with chunks that are too short or not discrete meaning units tends to produce an unnatural or potentially unclear translation. On the other hand, working with chunks that are too long, too easily remember, runs the risk of some meaning being missed in the translation. So it should not be too short, because the meaning will not be complete, and it will not be too long, because definitely there will be some meaning loss or semantic loss in the translation process. After this, step 3, review the accuracy of the translation. After the first draft, which comes from the second step, is completed, the translator will then methodically work through the translation, comparing each chunk of the text within the original source text or with the original source text. So makes a comparison between target language chunk that is translated with that chunk in the source text. The primary goal here is to confirm that they haven't missed any content or misinterpreted any meaning. Most translators will also identify and improve any slightly unnatural or inelegant wording in this step. After that comes to take a break. Step 4 is very important. The next step is very important, which is take a break. Put the translation aside and take a break, take a rest. Ideally, this should be for a few hours or overnight or one night. Should be away from you. Put it aside and take a break. The idea is purely to clear the mind to ensure a more effective fifth and final step. The final step is called refined translation wording, the organization of words. In the final step, the translator rereads the translation after the break, this time without reference to the source document, looking only at the quality of the expression, and they will make final edits to further refine and polish the translated text. In this way, it is as if you are not reading a translated text, an original text. You see where are the problems, where are the challenges, where are the unnatural pieces, bits and there. So this could be also considered the final touch of the translator. If you follow these steps, I'm sure that your translation tasks would be easier, more methodical, systematic, and it will yield very fruitful and good quality translations. Thank you very much for listening. Looking forward for creating more videos in the near future.